Shabbat Shalom. Today we're going to ask ourselves, I will ask myself the question aloud. Is there a rescue plan in the Bible that is presented to us for uncertain times, like always in the history of humankind? And what would that be? And the text today is presenting that in a beautiful way, and I would love to share that with you. For that, I'm going to start with the text in Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 16, 18 through 21, verse 9. And let's read it. It will be on the screen as well, but I will also read it for you. If screen or eyes would not to your help and assistance, I will be there to guide you through it. Think with me. Let your soul be receptive to what I'm saying, if you want, because then you are able to weigh more factors than only the intellectual part of you. There we go. When you come into the land which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination, a soothsayer or an augurer or a sorcerer or a charmer, a medium or a wizard or a necromancer. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord, and because of these abominable practices, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, because they do those things. So don't join them in that. What will Israel see? With what will it be confronted when they are going to live as a people in cities and villages instead of a people consisting of nomads and traveling through deserts? That was one of the many questions that went through the head of Israel, of the people, in that transition time of being nomads into being citizens. Moreover, the Lord had a plan with Israel, meaning, among other things, and we're going to go into it more, but the first important thing that you might think of yourself, the most important thing with this plan of salvation is the king on the throne, and at the same time the shepherd, both an image of the Lord who would save the world himself, cover and hold and hug the world, and doing that through Israel, because temple and Moses, Torah and all these things were given to Israel. Don't know if that is a privilege or a burden. I think it's a combination, but that's what it is. So when would this, in this trip where we don't see these things, we have a lot of insight into temple and priest and other things, but when would this plan of salvation with this king on the throne be visible, this plan of this rescue plan? Another question is, would the average Israelite be occupying himself or herself with these thoughts and these questions? Perhaps not literally. But I can imagine that there are moments of loneliness and despair, and someone would look up in the skies, waiting and hoping and crying for help. And you are already on that track then when you do that. And Moses, would he be busy with these thought answers? Yes, definitely. And specifically in the texts of the week, of this week. So, in other words, we read nowhere in the Bible about a king over Israel in the first 4 books of Moses, but in the text of this 5th book, and then specifically in the text of today, of this week, we read it in the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy. We read it, and I'm going to show it to you. We are going to show it to you on the screen. It's Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 and verse 15. When you come to that land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around about me. You may indeed set as king over you him whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brethren you shall set as a king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Same principle as in America. You may have a governor who is not born in the country, but as a president it should be somebody who is a citizen, born a citizen in the United States of America. Like Obama, President Obama was, although he was challenged in that, and he proved his citizenship, and there was a particular situation that I remember well. Anyway, in the text of today you find this text about this king, and you see that the Lord is adding. The Lord is adding that they would choose a king. They would choose a king like all the nations around me. I'm going to go in that addition in the text. So there were 3 important commandments that Israel had to give ear to and had to apply when they would go to the land, enter the land, establish in the land that was promised to the fathers of Israel. And those 3 important commandments were, first of all, asking for a king, not a king, asking. The asking was a commandment. Then the offspring of Amalek, they needed to be neutralized, as we sometimes say, and also the building of the temple. Those 3 things were very important. The last point is mentioned in Sanhedrin in the Talmud. It's exquisite and specific what this king was required to do and not to do. The king needed to have 2 Torot, 2 times a Torah, one for the treasure chest and one to read from on a daily basis. And this one to read, this was in order to realize that he was under the command of Torah and the giver of Torah. The dedication of the king with the anointment with oil is the same as sick people had to undergo, because in both situations you need to realize that you're under God's command and under his protection, under his healing. How much weight for this king that this Bible that he had? How much weight does this Bible have for us in our daily lives? That's a question I need to ask myself all the time. Do we have a treasure chest? And what is in the treasure chest? Difficult word. The good things, things that you need to put a question mark to, being bound to something which is precious to you, but could it lead you to serving other things, other gods even? The kings of Israel had the risk of being allowed to marry several women, of other people, and this could cause trouble, risk of going to other gods, and a multitude of horses could cause the problem that the king would go to his old lifestyle again. So all this dispersion, all this being distraction, having distraction could lead to a loss of faith, which is a warning for all of us. So there was a lot for this king to do in order to stay the righteous king that was needed for Israel all the time. So Israel gets the command, the order, not to join in the craziness of the surrounding countries with the surrounding people and nations. Not to worship what they were worshipping, and for the believers from those nations, it was the same question, but they didn't answer that. For the believers from the nations, not from the Jews, but for the nations who joined the religion of Israel, the same requirements count. What were the inhabitants of Canaan, the Canaanites, doing? they were burning their sons and daughters to sacrifice them to other gods, or they had to walk them on fire in order to have control over their body, mind over matter kind of things, in a way that was pleasuring other religions and was forbidden. And all these things that were trying to find future sayings and insight in that without the visible means, saying things about people that you could not have heard, and knowing something about the future like we sometimes hear in TV shows and Christian shows which are questionable, were forbidden. But also talking about the future with certain means, intestines of animals, coffee, remainder, leaves of tea, and the smoke coming out of a hole in rocks, in the country of Greece and other countries, where a prophetess was lying down and was out of her mind and just making sounds, and the priests were translating her speaking in tongues in ways that was profitable for them, in ways of politics, because other kings would come to listen to all the wisdom that these priests had and the power they were having and they were vested with. So all these things were forbidden. Being a sorcerer and doing voodoo and having the power and the control and manipulation on other people, which you can also do with other means than only being a sorcerer. Being very angry sometimes gives you the power over people. So, oh, I'm so sorry. And some people allow the angry person to be the boss in order to manipulate other people and get their will done. Or you can have your manipulation by crying as a means to distract and becoming the victim instead of the person who is responsible for something wrong. Also that, I think, belongs to this list. Talking to a dead person, the spirit of that dead person, asking questions, and that is being disobedient to Torah. Unless that person that passed away visits you, which happens in the Bible, in the New Testament, for instance, with Moses and Elijah, standing on a high mountain with Yeshua, and they are talking to each other, and 3 disciples are in awe, watching and listening to all that, because then you don't go to the person who passed away, but the person comes to you. It happens, whether you like it or not. This is reality. So it depends on who goes to the other person first. And in other words, the list of forbidden things that we find in this piece of Torah is not easy to interpret, because what do all these terms mean, and how do you apply it, and how does our prejudgment, our influence us in our reading the text as it is. And perhaps we'll never know in this life on earth what it literally means, because it's text that was written more than 3,000 years ago. But the warnings are there, and so we need to be careful. And clearly it shows that God doesn't want us to mingle in the religion of the other people, and this might happen also in our religion now in 2021. We may have certain elements in our faith that belong to other religions, and we didn't know that it had that background. Not joining the pagans in what they do is what the Lord says. What does that do to you? What does that do to a person, knowing that you cannot join what the pagans do? It makes you an outsider. It makes you a party pooper. It makes you an ivory tower inhabitant. At least certain people will call you that. And certain people will feel that you are judging them while you're not doing that. Others are saying that you don't belong to this world, and others say that you're belonging to a sect. Perhaps you've experienced this. these sayings come from non-believers, sometimes from believers, but they don't. They only see their own little thing and their own little circle as the things allowed, and the other things that are a little bit different as non-allowed or even occult or something like that. It's an incredible mess sometimes what these things are. So you need to be very sober in these things and be quiet in the weighing of all these things. Messianic Jewish congregations have sometimes an extra problem because you look like something known, Christian, and yet it's not known, and you look Christian, but then it's not Christian, and what is it? And you're going back to Judaism and the immaturity. I've heard people say, be yourself and weigh these things and pray to God for spiritual discretion. The warnings in the Bible are meant to save us from the things that are going on in different religions because they serve other gods, different gods. That, for starters, I'm coming back to this kingship and other things that belong to this plan of rescue, plan of salvation. Let's first go to the second main text in the Haftarah, meaning Isaiah 51, verse 12 through 15 in a greater context. The fourth consolation Haftarah. Fourth of the seven. After the seventh, a few days later, Rosh HaShanah will be there, and a new year will start from then. Let's go to the text. I am he that comforts you, says God. Who are you that you are afraid of man, mortal man who dies, of the Son of Man who is made like grass, and have forgotten the Lord your Master, your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth, and fear continually all the day because of the fury of the oppressor when he sets himself to destroy. And where is the fury of the oppressor? He who is bowed down shall speedily be released. He shall not die, and go down to the pit. Neither shall his bread fail. For I am the Lord your God, who stirs up the sea. That's an interesting thing. We'll go into that a little bit later. I am the Lord your God, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. Think of Jonah. We'll go into it later. The Lord of hosts is his name. So when you read this, you see that Isaiah is talking about the insecurities that we have to fight for ourselves, to insecurities, to you being allowed to give your opinion, criticism, which sometimes is meant to build us up, but we might feel it as a personal attack. These kind of things says, don't be afraid. God is your builder, he's your maker, he's your creator. Don't be afraid of people when they do illegal and nasty things to you. That's beautiful. That has to do with the plan of salvation, but that plan is bigger than this. So very special, very messianic are the words of Isaiah, this same prophet, today in Isaiah 52, verse 7 through 10. I love to read it to you. How beautiful upon the mountains of Israel are the feet of him who brings good tidings, who publishes peace, who brings good tidings of good, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Watch your watchmen lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. That's beautiful. It's almost like Isaiah is saying, after this time there will never be a problem with you again. We know it's different and wars have been there, but Isaiah is the prophet who says those are not from God. There has been calamities that came your way because of God, because he is trying to chastise his child. This is one way of showing his love and his care. After this time, no more. It's the fourth consolation Haftarah. Rescue and salvation is necessary to save us from all the confusion and all the so-called truths which are not truths. We live in a life, in a world, I mean, where so much information comes to us that we need to sift and use our discretion in order to see what's true and what's not. And there are tricks and so-called troll mail accounts which send information to us, where we are bombarded with so-called truths which are not truths but are meant to disturb a whole society. So be careful what you read. You cannot say, don't you know this? I read it on the internet. So, doesn't mean a thing when you read it on the internet. You need to see what your sources are. The things that we read in the Torah are clear, but what to think of situations in which a person is convinced of his or her being right, while the beholders clearly see that the person is wrong. Because when someone is convinced of something and convinced that he's not doing the wrong thing, then that person doesn't realize that salvation is necessary. In Isaiah 53, which is not part of this Haftarah text, but comes right after it, we read that there is someone who is a servant. He takes the salvation of the whole world on his shoulder. It's a Jewish man, and his name later on is made public and made known. It's the name of Yeshua. Judaism knows this. The name of Yeshua is mentioned in Jewish prayer books of Rosh HaShanah and Yom Kippurim, where it talks about the Metatron, and the name is Yeshua. It's the same name. Judaism knows this, but it's difficult because that name has been abused by all kinds of people and religions in a very, very wrong and deadly way. So it's very understandable that this will be concealed until the time that it can be freely published. But I'm mentioning it already. So in 53 we read that there is a servant who will take the salvation on his shoulders, and it's not a nice and honorable task if you look at it from a human point of view. It's a prophet like Moshe, like Moses, as he said in the text of today in Deuteronomy 18. We'll come to that in a moment. First we read in Isaiah 53 verse 5 and 6 the horrible words like these on the screen as well. He was wounded for our transgressions. Wounded. That's not giving the Grammy or the Pulitzer Prize or whatever. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole. And with his stripes on his body, bloody stripes, we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It's not fair, but he chose to do this. So it's very incredibly loving what God has done for us. That is the plan of salvation that we're talking about and we're looking into. That's what we read in Isaiah, but for this to be your thing, you need to realize that there is injustice in you. Be honest, be fair, look with realism to yourself. Let's go to the text in the New Testament, and then we go back to the plan of salvation that we found and find in the Torah text. First, therefore, Luke chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. There we go. One day, Yeshua got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let's go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a storm of wind came down on the lake, which happens a lot on Yam Kinneret, the lake of Galilee. And they were filling with water, and they were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he woke up up and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was calm. And he said to them, I'm glad you called me, because we could have drowned. Couldn't you have called me earlier? That's not what he says. He says, where is your faith? And they were afraid and also marveled, saying one to another, who is this guy that he commands even wind and water and they obey him? Guy meant in the most respectful of ways. Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. The attention, the focus in this happening, in this story, is always on the quieting of the storm. But what you need to look at is how this wind, how this storm and these waves and this life-threatening situation, how it came into being. Sometimes things happen in our lives in order to show us what our motives are, in order to have us grow. Think of the times and the years in the desert that Israel had to go through. That is what we can go through as well in times that are happening in our lives and situations. The Talmidim, the students, the followers of Yeshua, are on a boat on the Yam Kinneret, the Lake of Galilee. Yeshua is sleeping, and there is a storm, and there is waves. Hey, what did we read in Isaiah 51 verse 15? Let's read it again. For I am the Lord your God who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. We read that just a minute ago. So the sea, sometimes the sea will be blown into waves by God himself. Think of Jonah, who was on a ship, and the same thing happened to him. The same thing happened to the followers of Yeshua in a ship where Yeshua is, among other things, the prophet who is proclaiming the good news. Jonah was a prophet who had to proclaim good news. God commanded him to do it, and he refused to do it. So Jonah, chapter 1, verse 3 through 5. We read, Jonah rose after he was given this order to go to Nineveh. He rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa, Yaffo, Tel Aviv at the moment, and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid. Is it mariners or mariners? I'll find out. And each cried to his God. And they threw the wares that were in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship. After lying down, he was fast asleep. A little bit like what happened to Yeshua, although there's this vast difference between Jonah and Yeshua. Yeshua did his mission. Jonah was fleeing from his mission. Storms are sometimes of the Lord to have us grow. In which parts do we need to grow? Say in general terms that we need to find out that in each and every situation and on every spot where we go, in everything that we experience, God is the Lord. God is the boss in our lives. Also mentioned in that list of forbidden things that we just read. All these ways of being a sorcerer, to say it that way. Who grows, who is learning to recognize that, is recognizing the Lord in the storm, in the earthquake, in the desert experience that you might be in right now. Jonah needed to learn to proclaim the words that God gave him with courage and with modesty. Courage because of the exciting and threatening situations on hostile territory. Modesty because of the people who came to faith, and they were his enemies, and not only his enemies but the enemies of his people. Then you need modesty in order to say, okay, we're brothers and sisters. I don't like it at all, but they're now my brothers and sisters. So prophets like Jonah had to go through experiences of waves that were threatening his life. And teachers and proclaimers are part of the salvation plan of God. Now let's read Isaiah again, 51, but then verse 15 that we read, and the next verse, verse 16, because it's interesting. It also talks about these waves that God is causing, and each authentic teacher will experience those, I'm telling you. And Isaiah 51 is talking about this in terms of being a teacher, a proclaimer, a prophet in a sense. Let's read it. Isaiah 51 verse 15 and 16. First 15 we read it already, and then 16. For I am the Lord your God who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. And I have put my words in your mouth. There we go. Now it's in the mouth of the listener of Israel. And hid you in the shadow of my hand, stretching out the heavens, laying the foundation of the land, and saying to Zion, you are my people. So it's very interesting that also there Israel is called, has the calling to be a prophet, a proclaimer, and he's also experiencing those waves, needs to realize that it's God who is doing it, but know that you are protected in his hand. This is what Yeshua was asking his followers. Where's your faith? You know Isaiah saying that there will be waves, and you know that you are protected in God's hands. That's what it was. So back to Israel with the order to ask for a king when they had established themselves in the land. It was not only allowed that Israel asked for a king, it was ordered that they would do that. That belongs to the plan of rescue that the Lord has with the world and with Israel in particular. Also because the prophecies about the Messianic age have to do everything to do with a king in the line, the dynasty of King David. A just and righteous king would be able to go against false gods and wrong developments. And this king, this righteous king, would allow Israel and help Israel, assist Israel in developing itself in a spiritual sense and grow. The position of king is mentioned in chapter 17 of Deuteronomy. And chapter 18, another part of another important function that belongs to the plan of salvation is mentioned, but in chapter 17 the position of king and the asking for king is mentioned. Now, when later on the great prophet Samuel goes against the request of the people of Israel for a king, when he does that, was it because he was jealous? But was it because he wanted to change God's rescue plan? The answer is no. He was angry and he resisted it because the motive with which Israel asked that question to have that king, that was what made him angry. The motive was that the surrounding people had kings, and so therefore we need to have a king too. That's not the right motive. That's quite something else than having the motive that a righteous king would allow them and help them to lead and inspire. That kind of a king would show what a just and righteous servitude and being a servant to the Lord would entail. So when you ask yourself what would have happened if King Saul did the right thing, and with the question, would there ever be a King David if King Saul would have done the right thing, and there would not have been a place for King David? You need to realize that King Saul was the king with his shortcomings and his psychiatric problems, and yet when Israel asked and cried for a king, they did it with the wrong motive and they got the wrong king. This is what happens in the world even now. A people of a country will create a spiritual environment in which a leader, be it a king or a president or whatever, in which a king or at least a leader will be equal to the mentality and the motive of the collective motive that the people has, and he will come to power. And this is what happened with Saul, who therefore failed. So the reason that the Lord gives this order to ask for a king is not only posing the question, but also growing to the right motive. Like Jonah needed to have the right motive to be the prophet that he was called to be. And we in our lives need to go through our motives, in order not going through the motions, but through our motives, in order to become the people that God wants us, and you and me, to be. The motive why this king was necessary. So a king, establishing a king as over Israel was part of God's plan of salvation. Like all the commandments of the Bible are part of God's plan of salvation, believe it or not. I will prove it to you, because there is a text in the New Testament that shows incredibly clear that this is so. You will see Paul being in love and very enthusiastic about the commandments, and you see him do this not only in Acts chapter 21, when he brings 4 guys to the temple to bring animal sacrifices for a Nazirite vow. That's what he does. Believe it or not, read the book of Acts chapter 21. But also Paul is in Jubilee about the commandments in the Bible. And in his letter to the believers of the city of Colossae, the Colossians, he does this. So we're going to look at the text in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 and 17. On the screen we read, "Therefore," Paul says, and please understand who the you is and who he is talking to. He's talking to the believers, the Messianic congregation in Colossae. And there is people around them that are judging them for keeping Torah. So he's saying, therefore let no one pass judgment, no one of your neighbors pass judgment on you, congregation, in questions of food and drink, the kashrut in Hebrew, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbath. Because those commandments are a foreshadowing of that what is to come, which is the body of Messiah becoming visible. That is what it says. You might have total different text, something like, but the truth is Messiah, or something like that, but it doesn't say that. It has 3 words in the last part of verse 17, saying the body, Messiah, and one other word. Nothing else, not truth and whatever. But the translators don't want you to realize that Paul is a Torah lover, a Torah faithful person, Torah faithful Jew. The body of Messiah becoming visible in our doing the orders, the commandments of the Lord. King David belongs to this body of believers. And all the commandments, including food and drink and feasts, biblical feasts, prepare us for being part and entering into this body of believers. It's part of God's plan of salvation. So also that is a factor today in our list of what is the plan of salvation consisting of. By the way, Messiah, king, yes, but he's also a prophet and he's also a priest. And the interesting thing, the really interesting thing I'm so enthusiastic about is each of these positions is surrounded with secrecy and mystery. And I will show it to you. It's clear in a couple of verses you'll see how this goes. I'm saying the wrong thing here. Title of a movie. King Saul there is this motive thing, this wrong motive thing that brought the wrong king on the throne, the wrong person on the wrong moment. But his replacement, King David, was almost not found. When Samuel was looking for the replacement of King Saul already, when Saul was still living, Samuel knew that there needed to be a new king. He went to the father of David, and Yishai, and Jesse in English, I think. And the father wasn't thinking of David when he presented his proud group of sons, commanders in the army of Israel, and Samuel heard the voice of the Lord saying, there's someone else, he's not here. Interesting situation. And this is part of this secrecy and this mystery around these three positions of Yeshua being king, prophet, and the other position, the priest and the king and the prophet. So David's father did not really estimate well the value of his youngest son, and God's plan was in danger. But it was restored, like with the birth of Moses, who also belongs in God's plan of salvation and in the body of Messiah. When Moses was born, he was, according to the plan of the Pharaoh of that time, he would have been drowned, but he was saved, fortunately. So secrecy and mystery was also in the position of prophet, am I saying, and I will prove it to you, as part of the offices of Messiah. Also that position is in the text of today, in chapter 18. It's the secrecy that you find in the book of Exodus, chapter 23, verse 20 through 22, where this position of prophet is already mentioned, that we recognize in Messiah. Let's read it. Exodus 23, verse 20, on the screen. Behold, I send an angel before you in your travel from the land of Egypt to the land of the promised land, Israel. I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place which I have prepared. Give heed to him. Hearken to his voice. Listen to his voice. Pay attention to his voice. His voice. Remember this, because I'll get back to that. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression. For my name is in him. Very important addition. But if you pay attention to his voice, again that voice, and do all I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. So it's not just an angel. That would be interesting enough, but it's an angel with God's name within him, and therefore also the divinity and the life that only God can give and possesses. We receive it from God, but this angel had it in him. But pay attention. The Lord says, listen to him. And then verse 22, once again, if you pay attention to his voice and do all that I say. That's an interesting saying. You pay attention to his voice and then you do what I say. That's because his voice is saying exactly the words that God gives him. Like Yeshua is also claiming, I only say the words that God gives me. This is the recognition of a real prophet. He speaks, and through his words, people are doing what God is saying. Pay attention to the word voice. In Psalms 95, you find in verse 7 exactly something is said about this. For he is our God, we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Oh, that today you would hearken to his voice. Yeshua talks about it in John chapter 10 verse 4, also on the screen, and it says, when he has brought you out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, before they listen to his voice? No, they know his voice. This is an interesting little detail, very important detail. When you hear a voice inside you, you need to not automatically claim that it's God speaking. You need to know that you recognize God's voice. It's not the same thing automatically by default. So this angel goes in front of them. He goes before them in John chapter 10, like the angel in Exodus 23 was going in front of the troops of traveling Israel. And Israel knows his voice and recognizes his voice and listens to his voice, pay attention and obeys his voice. Also believers who are not Jewish, not born Jewish, or who cannot find their genealogy exactly, also they recognize his voice. You find that in John 10:16, the important text, John 10:16. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will heed my voice. So there shall be one flock, one shepherd. So this describes the prophet position of Yeshua. Moses talks about it in the text of today in Deuteronomy. I already said it, hinted to it. Deuteronomy 18 verses 15 and 18. We read that now. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, says Moses, and he's an incredible, exalted prophet with the capacity, the mental capacity, the spiritual capacity to see God and to be in his presence in a way that no other prophet has ever done. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren, a Jewish prophet. Him must you heed. Old English. Verse 18, I will raise up for them a prophet like you. This is God speaking to Moses. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. This is the beautiful job description of a prophet. And that is so in line with the text of this secretive angel, plan of salvation we're talking about. And interestingly enough, it's also the priesthood in this text of today that is mentioned. The priesthood of also Messiah, the priesthood as part of this plan of salvation. Also enveloped in secrecy. There's a special Cohen in the text when you read the text today, a Cohen Gadol, a high priest, that is put in place, in position, in order to speak to the military troops and to encourage them, and he will be dedicated and in the way that the usual high priest is brought into function. He needs to encourage, it's something like an army rabbi in our days, and tell them that there will be salvation and that God will save the troops. Nothing secretive about that. But yet it is, because the position of high priest is for always, for all times, made secretive, and I will show you how this is done. It's not difficult at all. Not only because the high priest was only allowed into the Holy of Holies once a year, on Yom Kippur, not only because Pinchas became high priest as somebody from a different line than being a son of Aaron, the brother of Moses, but most of all because our archfather Abraham had a special, unique meeting, encounter with a high priest of a special, unique order. Joseph had a special meeting with somebody that was so unknown, a man from nowhere, who showed Joseph the way to Dothan. Likewise, Abraham met a high priest coming from nowhere, out of the blue, without any genealogy. In the New Testament, the Hebrew letter talks about this in chapter 7 verse 3. We read it also. He is without father or mother or genealogy. He has neither beginning of days nor end of life, mentioned in the text, but resembling the Son of God, he continues to be a priest forever. So something very mysterious and mystique about this. His name, Melchizedek. Melchizedek, as if this person Melchizedek is the prototype, has been the prototype of all the priests of Israel. David sings about this priest in his Psalm 110, about this special priest Melchizedek. And he says in verse 1 of Psalms 110 something that catches the eye or ear. It's on the screen. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And he's talking to the Messiah. Talking about the priesthood of our Messiah. So this Messiah is sitting at the right hand of God. And in Psalms 110 verse Psalms 110 verse 1, I think I read the wrong text. It says, a psalm of David, the Lord says to my Lord. David is talking, who is the Lord of, why are there two Lords in the Psalm of David? Because the one Lord is the Lord in heaven, and the other Lord is Messiah. The Lord says to my Lord, sit you, Lord, at my right hand, till I make your enemies your footstool. This idea of a Lord sitting next to the Lord is known in Judaism as the Metatron position, sitting at God's right hand, and mentioned in the Machzor of Yom Kippur and Rosh HaShanah, and the name of this Metatron, special angel with God's name in him, is Yeshua. Literally, I've seen the text. So there's nothing blah blah about this. This is just a fact. This position in Psalms 110 can only be given to Messiah. David knows him, sings about him in this first verse, and this secretive figure is spoken to by the Lord in Psalms 110 verse 4. Now I'm going to read it as I should. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You, Messiah, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So Abraham is, I think, comes into contact with Messiah at that moment in the body of Melchizedek. Later on, Yeshua is in the body of a Jewish man, as God has said. Messiah is Jewish, but it's the same Messiah in different people, in different bodies, as God can do that at different times in the timeline of Israel. Same text you find in Hebrews chapter 7 verse 17. So the text of this week is a very Messiah focused text. And our Messiah, your Messiah, is king, he's priest, he's prophet. As king, he is your Lord, he is your master. He reminds you that the kingship is saved by God when human failure was rampant with the father of David. He reminds you that the kingship of the God of the Jews can only succeed if the king will be faithful to Torah, like King David taught his son Shlomo when David was on his deathbed. And you find this in 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 3 and 4. I would love to read it. Keep the charge of the Lord your God. Keep the charge, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, Torah, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if you sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul. You see how old soul already is. There shall not fail you a man on the throne of Israel. Doing everything what's in Torah is being part of this plan of salvation. Characteristic of the first words of Yeshua is that he also says, I didn't come to do away with the law. I'm fulfilling the law. You should do the same, he says in Matthew 5 verse 19, when he speaks in public for the first time. Which is no rules, but it's this plan of salvation. All these things. We've seen Paul in Colossians chapter 2 verse 16 and 17 say the same. As priest, Yeshua is the man who, in the body of Melchizedek, was a special, in a special role to assist Abraham. And see those two, Abraham and Melchizedek, when they meet, and then recognize Melchizedek in Yeshua, because both are embodiments of Messiah in the earlier and later moments on the time frame of Israel as people. And then also Yeshua is prophet, the one who speaks to you personally. Learn to recognize and to acknowledge and to obey his voice. You hear Yeshua, you hear the Lord. Those two are one. Visible in the commandments, in the feasts, in the Shabbat, visible in your and my behavior. The feasts show the body of Messiah. Learn to see it and to discuss it and to see it as a visible representation when you do these beautiful Torah commandments. You want to be part of this body of Messiah, especially with this kind of plan, this beautiful plan of salvation. I wish you Shabbat Shalom.